Pacific NorthWEIRD, Pacific NorthWEIRD.
My name is James Clarkson, and I am a ufologist, which means that I take the subject of UFOs very seriously. This is my wife, Joanne. I've been researching, writing about, lecturing on UFOs for the better part of 20 years now, seriously, and I've been interested in UFOs since I was about 12 years old, which would be more years ago than I probably would care to admit. I'm also the state director for the Mutual UFO Network in Washington. I've been involved with MUFON since 1986, and I just have to say this is the subject I love. There's nothing, no mystery that I can think of that captivates me more than trying to get to the bottom of the mystery of UFOs and trying to figure out exactly what or who it is that's contacting us, because I am convinced overwhelmingly by the strength of the evidence and the witness testimony that some form of non-human intelligence has been repeatedly contacting humanity for a long time, and that it's still occurring. I know that sounds really extraordinary, but it's based on, I think, some pretty well-founded research. And I should also say that I just retired, but I retired from 30 years of serious investigation, 20 years as a police officer. I spent the last 10 years of that career as a sergeant. I've been a detective sergeant, a supervisor of a fatal accident team, a child abuse detective, a detective sergeant, a patrol sergeant. I've done a whole lot of things. And then I completed 10 years as an investigator for the state agency investigating fraud. So I try to bring the same standard of care to my UFO investigations that I brought to the cases that were put in front of me when I had those other roles. And I try to be very serious about what I do. But it's also something I'm passionate about, because what could be better than being the person who gets the Motherlode Ufo event? I can't think of anything that would be better than that.
What would be the Motherlode UFO event for you, if you could hypothetically describe that event?
Well, I guess there would be two sides to it. One of them would be, would it be an event that would be overwhelming and fantastic just for me? And would it be an event that where I would have proof or evidence that I could take to other people that would convince them that everything needs to change in how we look at the universe, how we look at each other? I really do believe that if we could get proof of contact, the human race would be forced to start thinking differently about how we treat each other, how we treat this tiny little blue marble, and how we go forward into the future. So I see it as a possible game changer. There would be a lot of uproar, there would be a lot of adjustments that would have to be made, but in the end, I think it would all be for the good. Because the other thing is that captivates me, if we prove that UFOs are real and that they are some sort of evidence of advanced non-human technology, immediately everybody is going to know that there are alternative energy sources. Because obviously UFOs are not running on internal combustion engines based upon hydrocarbon fuel. That is not happening. So if we became aware that UFOs were coming and going, that they are some sort of transportation for an advanced non-human intelligence, everybody's going to know that oil is not the only way to go. Now that's going to be really upsetting if you own stock in an oil company, or if you are the head of an oil company. That's not going to be good news. And that, of course, is one of the arguments as to why there's been ongoing secrecy, The other argument is that this will be very upsetting to many of our cultural institutions, although even that seems to be changing recently, because I noticed that the Pope and the Catholic Church have taken a much more liberal attitude about our space brothers. And they've basically said that when they come here, they will be welcomed, and if they want to convert, we'll be glad to baptize them, which I never thought I would hear that.
Would you, sorry. Are you kidding?
One of my local space brothers. No.
I do like the kind of cat that sounds in the background are kind of funny.
It adds authenticity.
Yeah. That's some real stuff there, man. So let's talk a bit about Aberdeen. Think of this as like your past. I want to know a little bit about Aberdeen, how you got led to ufology, the UFO cop thing, maybe even how you two met.
Aha.
Yeah.
The romantic part.
Right.
There you go. Well, actually, that is sort of a shaggy dog story, but I'll try to keep it short.
Well, this is where I'm famous because I actually introduced him to June Crane.
That's true.
And who is June Crane?
June Crane was a lady that I met when I was giving a UFO lecture in Ocean Shores, Washington in 1993. And afterwards, a very stern-looking elderly lady approached me and said, "You're right, the government knows all about UFOs and they're keeping it a secret." And I could tell that she was totally serious and that she seemed like she was very sane. And I said, "Well, how do you know?" And she said, "Because I work there." And so I said, "Will you tell me more?" And she kind of looked at me out of the side of her eye and she said, "I can't because they'll come and arrest me." Now that was there was kind of a sub-level there, because I did not make it a secret that when I wasn't giving UFO lectures, my regular job, I was a commissioned police officer with the city of Aberdeen. In fact, I was the detective sergeant. So I think June kind of thought that maybe I was going to come and arrest her. But that's another long story, and it turned out that she really did work for Wright-Patterson Air Force Base 3 different times between 1942 and 1952. She worked in top secret laboratories, and she was around scientists and engineers, and they casually mentioned either directly to her or around her, they talked about UFOs. And to make a long story short, what they talk about behind closed doors under top secret security is a little different than what they tell the public about their knowledge of UFOs. They are like 2 different worlds. And so that, of course, became a major investigation. But I thought we were going to go back to the past.
Let's go back to the past.
Okay.
Well, we were I just made the comment that I introduced you to June Crane, who is the subject of your book, and some of your UFO fame, honey.
I know.
I met Jim when I was a librarian down in Aberdeen, and actually we met because of Bigfoot. Every year the sheriff of Grace Harbor County would do a program in the Aberdeen Library about Bigfoot, and he had plaster casts of huge footprints, and he had hair, and he had a tape with screams. But he called me the morning of the program to tell me that he couldn't do it. But I couldn't cancel it because we get 100 people for that easy. So I asked him if I could have the boxes of stuff and I'd do the program. So I was sitting in the sheriff's office waiting for the Bigfoot stuff, and Jim was actually sitting there waiting for a subpoena. And when Dennis brought the Bigfoot stuff out, Jim was quite fascinated and asked if he could carry it to my car. And so when he carried it to my car, I also had UFO books in the back seat because I was going to do a children's program on aliens later. But he thought he had met the woman of his dreams.
Actually, I did.
I know that. What other woman would want Bigfoot hair and UFO books, especially in Aberdeen? And so we went out to the lake and talked that afternoon. It took him 5 years to pop the question, but, these ufologists are a cautious lot. And but we did meet because of Bigfoot. So, and then also when I found out he was so interested, I thought, he was even a better presenter probably than the sheriff. He was quite articulate and so into this. And I needed someone to do these programs. So someone besides me who just read the books and did them. So I got him a gig at the Aberdeen Library, and then, you know, there's 25 Timberland libraries, plus Ocean Shores, which isn't part of Timberland, but is local. And everybody wanted that because it got men and boys into the library. What other program gets men and boys into a public library? And so I arranged for him to speak at Ocean Shores, and June Crane, whose name was June Kaba then, was the president of the Friends of the Ocean Shores Library and actually paid for his performance, and also had strong-armed members of the community into giving enough money to build a beautiful library. June was not a woo-woo person. She was a realtor lady, very professional, very kind of stern. She scared me. June scared me. She was not warm and fuzzy. But she ended up being a major figure in both of our lives.
Excellent. So let's talk a bit about your time in the police.
Okay. I'm actually from San Francisco. I grew up there. I even went to Berkeley, California in the 70s, and I used to have really long hair. So actually for me to end up as a police officer is kind of a strange odyssey, but it happened. And in fact, after being so adamantly against the war in Vietnam, I ended up enlisting. But I enlisted as the war was winding down, and I figured I wasn't going to get sent anywhere, which I wasn't. And I wanted to get away and do something different, and I decided to get into law enforcement. So I came to Washington State courtesy of Uncle Sam, and I was a military policeman at Fort Lewis. However, after a few months, I got appointed as a military police investigator, which meant that for most of the time I was in the military, I wore a sport coat and a tie and a shoulder holster, and I never had to wear a uniform. And it was very strange because I was only a specialist 4, but everybody would sir me. Because you know in the military, if you see somebody driving an unmarked sedan with a whip antenna and they're wearing a sport coat and a tie, you better be on the safe side and sir them. So it was kind of an interesting time. I got out, started taking tests, and I came out number 1 on Aberdeen's list. I didn't know anything about Aberdeen. I'd never been there. But it was a chance to be a full-time policeman, and that was really important to me, so I took the job. I ended up working there for 20 years, and of course along the way, Joanne and I got together. But Aberdeen is a very strange town. When the police chief hired me, he said at the end of our one-on-one interview, he said, "I need to tell you something." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Aberdeen officers fight at the drop of a hat, and frequently we drop the hat." And I thought, well, okay. And I will say that it's a pretty rough and tumble place. Now, there are a lot of really, really good people there, and there are a lot of gorgeous residential areas up in the hills. There's also an awful lot of poverty, despair, alcoholism, drugs, a lot of very sad people. And in terms of being a young policeman, great opportunity to learn all the basics. I worked there for 6 months before they sent me to the academy, and I think I had already investigated every serious felony at least once. Because that's just what happens. It's a busy place to be a policeman. That, of course, I was so busy, the first year that I was there in 1979, I didn't read the newspaper, and it turned out that I missed one of the biggest stories of my whole ufological career because I didn't pick up the Aberdeen newspaper on Monday, November 26, 1979, when the headline read, "UFO crash in Oak River." And it wasn't until 6 years later that I ended up going back and getting all of the newspapers, all of the articles, recontacting all of the witnesses, and learning that we had a mini Roswell event right in Grays Harbor, right here in Washington State, on November 25th, 1979, at 10:50 p.m., right outside of Westport, Washington. That turned out to be a major UFO investigation too. But also kind of turning back to Aberdeen and what it was all about. In 1980, the same police chief who hired me had his retirement function, and at that event, he admitted to me that on day one of his career in 1955, his job as an Aberdeen police officer was to be the bagman for the police department. The bagman would go around and collect the bribes, as in money, from the houses of ill repute down on Hume Street in Aberdeen. What is now State Street in Aberdeen was originally called Hume Street, and it was known to every merchant sailor who ever sailed the Pacific because it had more whorehouses than any other city. And in fact, in World War II, the Armed Forces Police, they would put out a list of places that service members were not allowed to go. They didn't even bother. They put the entire city of Aberdeen off limits because it was such a rough and tumble place. Going back in history, Billy Gould turns out to have been a serial killer who took, we don't know how many merchant seamen from around the world, hit them over the head, steal their money, throw them through a trap door into the Wishkah River. And of course, these people are basically undocumented, and nobody would miss them until months and months later. So nobody really knows how many people were murdered by him. I mean, this is kind of a wild place. A lot of old school hunters and fishermen, loggers. I mean, it's kind of a rough and tumble community. It still has that kind of air about it even now.
So it's the picking up the newspaper 6 years later. Is that was you say the genesis of what got you into ufology or got you interested?
No, actually it isn't. The way that I got into ufology was that a long time ago when I was in San Francisco, and I think it was the first weekend, there's kind of a big weekend when your parents want to go away and they let you stay alone at the house. And that's a big deal. Well, I was listening to KGO radio, and they were interviewing a man named John G. Fuller, who had just come out with a brand new book. This is like early 60s, called Incident at Exeter, New Hampshire, referring to a really important series of UFO events that involved police officers as eyewitnesses to UFOs, an ongoing series of events, remarkable UFO cases. I was totally spellbound, and that led to me from that point on collecting magazine articles, paperback books, anything I could lay my hands on. And like many people who are involved in the investigation of UFOs, a lot of them trace their fascination back to one movie. The movie is The Day the Earth Stood Still, the original black and white version starring Michael Rennie, Sam Jaffe, and I can't remember the female lead. But in any event, absolutely, I guess you would say a groundbreaking movie that changed the way people looked at the world, UFOs, everything else. Well, going forward into the future, I eventually ended up in the Army, in the military police, and as I said, I was a plainclothes MP. I was an MP investigator. And one night I was talking to the desk sergeant, and this, of course, is at Fort Lewis in the military police station. He has a huge desk, a big piece of plexiglass, and underneath it are all these business cards, like who you're going to call when something bad happens. So I'm up there shooting the breeze with him, drinking coffee, and I look down and I see this card, and it says National UFO Reporting Center, 206-722-3000. So I said, Sarge, what's that? And he looks down and he says, oh, that's where we report UFOs. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So we went on and we talked about things that he had heard about UFOs. And he had been to Europe, and he claimed that he had seen UFOs by some runway. And this was before I started seriously investigating UFOs, so I didn't pin him for the details. But it's that kind of thing that keeps me going in the UFO field, because if you get any group of people together and you bring up the subject of UFOs just to see what will happen, after you get past what we call the giggle factor, where people are talking about little green men, people with tinfoil hats, all that kind of thing, inevitably one or more people in the group will say, well, you know, I saw something, or they will tell you that someone they know and trust has seen something. And then away you go, and everybody's got a story. Well, there's way too much fact, way too much smoke for there not to be some fire underneath all of that. But getting back to the business card, I memorized that business card, National UFO Reporting Center. In 1986, we flash forward, there was a very famous UFO case that happened over Anchorage, Alaska. I believe it was November. It involved a pilot of a JAL cargo plane, Captain Kenji Chiroshi, was flying a JAL flight into Anchorage. He and his crew saw a UFO that was like as big as 2 aircraft carriers. It had small UFOs flying around it. Initially, its presence was confirmed by FAA on their radar. Then the press got a hold of it. There was a huge commotion because of the credibility of the witnesses, the radar confirmation, etc. And then the FAA did the 2-step shuffle and said, well, maybe we didn't really have it on the radar. I was so fascinated by this, I decided it was time, and I called that phone number, 206-722-3000. And a man named Robert Gribble answered it. Robert Gribble was a retired Seattle firefighter, and he founded an organization called the National UFO Reporting Center, which is now run by a good friend of mine named Peter Davenport. And if you look him up, you know, he's like an icon in the Pacific Northwest because of his work. Well, I called and I said, I don't want to report a UFO, but I want to know, can I do something? I don't want to be on the sidelines anymore. And so he said, have you ever heard of MUFON? And I said, no. And I guess thereby hangs the tale. I applied, became a member. Because of my police background and my investigative background, I was made into a state section director almost immediately. I guess you call it battlefield promotion. And eventually, as the years went by, probably about 7 or 8 years ago now.
At least. Yeah,
Larry and Marilyn Childs, who were the directors for the state, they're getting on in years, and they came to me and said, will you take it? So that's what I've done ever since, is be the director for the Mutual UFO Network.
I want to talk a little bit more, or start talking a bit more about what exactly Washington MUFON is and what happens there.
Well, Washington MUFON is part of a parent organization, which is, I guess you would say, MUFON, Mutual UFO Network, which is a national organization and now has representatives in some foreign countries. I think the membership, because of some very strong recruiting efforts in the last couple of years, is up to 8,000 or 9,000 members. Now, being a member of MUFON initially means that you paid the basic membership fee, which makes you a subscriber to the monthly publication, which is, you know, straight UFOs, technical analysis, astronomy, some advertising related to UFOs, equipment, procedures. It's really interesting stuff. People who want to go further take an open book test. They get themselves a manual, they study it, they pass the test, and then they become certified as field investigators. And people who want to go further than that can volunteer for positions of leadership. And in every state, we have a director, an assistant director, section directors, and then field investigators. Now, we're spread a little thin in Washington State, so I don't have all those positions filled yet. So, you know, obviously I'm always looking for talented, qualified people who want to investigate UFOs. Now, what happens is MUFON has a website that can be reached, you know, obviously anywhere the internet is, and people can make reports now on PCs, laptops, tablets, smartphones, any number of ways they can access the reporting form, and they are asked basic questions about, you know, who, what, when, where, why, and how of whatever their UFO experience is. If they say that it happened in Washington, all of those reports come through me. After they've had an initial screening to make sure that there's enough there to do anything with, then they come to me, and then I evaluate them and decide who's going to investigate them. So much like a detective sergeant would, I get incoming cases, I evaluate them, I try to think of who's the best person for the job, and then they will rely upon me for assistance, and or when they're all done, they send back their completed report, and then I sign off on it, or I send it back, and we go on from there. Now, that of course, a lot of times, I will just say it freely, most UFO sightings, we don't have physical evidence. No, a UFO sighting is even more difficult than a ghost sighting. If someone says they've seen a ghost, for instance, I've worked with some of the paranormal groups here in Washington State, and they have like a SWAT team of technicians that will go to a location, and they set up infrared detectors, temperature monitors, audio recording equipment, anything to document the presence of whatever the phenomena is that's been reported. Now, that works really well for an interior environment, a fixed location. The problem with UFOs is I can't tell you where the next one's going to be. And there really isn't a way for me to practically monitor the sky. I mean, yes, theoretically, I suppose we could have people out every night watching, but we sort of do anyway. And I would just say as a side note, I've never seen this statistically analyzed, but I'm thinking that more smokers report UFOs than people who aren't smokers. And the reason for that is a lot of people who smoke can't smoke indoors anymore. So you would be surprised at the number of UFO reports I get that start off with, I went outside to smoke a cigarette, ... And I looked up, and away we go. Then we get the report.
Since Washington banned smoking, say in bars and clubs and stuff, did you notice an uptick in UFO sightings after that?
No. I just think in general it's always been that way. It waxes and wanes according to the weather more than anything else, because obviously over here in Western Washington especially, we have quite a few months where you don't get to see the night sky very often.
Of course, a lot of our reports are historical. For some reason, people that saw a UFO in 1962 suddenly feel the need to talk about it. In fact, I bet, at least maybe a quarter to a third of them are old, don't you think?
That's true.
Yeah.
And what type of criteria do you go about to investigate really old UFO cases like that?
Well, usually, actually most UFO cases hang upon the testimony of the primary witnesses. So then it becomes a credibility assessment. In other words, you talk to the person, you ask them to go over the event, and obviously part of interviewing people, which I learned many years ago, is you learn how to get information from people, I'll be honest, without letting them know that you're doing it. And the way that you do that is by being friendly. Everything is an investigation. Everybody is trying to find out something, and that's an investigation. We're just a little more systematic about it. And you obviously, you want to let the person know that you care about them, that we are going to maintain their confidentiality, because we do not give out names, addresses, phone numbers, any of that stuff for the witnesses, unless that person specifically tells us that it's okay. Because there's a stigma, unfortunately, attached to being a UFO witness, and we don't want to discourage people from reporting to us. Now, on the other hand, we do take what they report and the report of the investigator and any photographs or audio recordings or whatever. That's loaded back onto the website, and anybody can go in there and research it You don't have to be a member of MUFON. You can go on the MUFON website and search anything you want. You can ask how many cigar-shaped UFOs were there between 1975 and 2000 in the state of Washington, and it will kick out all the reports and give them to you. Now, of course, all the reports. People, you have to realize that there are way more UFOs than ever get reported. Somebody has to decide that it's worth reporting. Then they have to work up the courage to actually report it. So, in other words, each level screens out some of the cases. So the UFO phenomena may be a bit like an iceberg, and there may be more of it that we don't see than what we do see.
Why do you personally think we are being visited?
Well, now there's the $64,000 question that's both broad and deep. There are many, many possibilities. First off, if you open your mind up to the idea that we have been contacted by non-human intelligent species, where there is one, there must be many. There is no reason to suppose that there is one kind of alien. Just like there's not one kind of bird, one kind of insect, one kind of anything. I believe that the way that life has proliferated on the Earth is probably a good model for how it proliferates across the universe. In other words, life is a force in and of itself that attempts to take advantage of whatever the environment will give it. And if that means having a different color, a different shape, a different form, a different agenda, then it will do so. So in other words, why are they here? Well, there may be a whole lot of reasons why they're here. We could be a game preserve. We could be a research station. We could be an interesting accident that tourists like to look at. We could also be the descendants of beings that came here long ago. This, of course, is all hypothetical, conjectural, very difficult to prove. It's the ancient aliens theory. In other words, the day that we actually meet them, what if it turns out to be a family reunion? Now there's something that's going to really get people's attention. I personally think that if we knew the history of humanity on this planet, if we really knew it, we would be utterly and completely shocked, because I think it's completely different than the way we've been led to believe. I think we've misinterpreted the ruins of ancient civilizations. We have it all wrong. And at the same time, we may have some of it right. How would you describe a 747 Airliner if you lived 200 years ago? You could only describe it with the words that you had in your vocabulary. You couldn't talk about a turbine jet engine. You couldn't talk about what alloys were used to construct the skin of the aircraft, because those things did not exist. You couldn't talk about how a cell phone was made. How would you describe a cell phone, or what would you do with it if you had it 200 years ago? There's no, there'd be no way of understanding it, which I think is the problem that we've faced, or that the military has faced, trying to retro-engineer the technology of crashed UFOs. They don't have the technological base to know what they're dealing with, so they're desperately scrambling to try and figure out, what does this mean? How was it built? How does it work? And then, of course, aside from the fact that they would like to know in general, everybody would like to weaponize the technology, which is probably an even more frightening scenario.
So, you're the UFO cop. Tell me about that.
Well, that sort of evolved because when you're a police officer, in the very beginning, I did not tell any of the people I worked with that I was interested in UFOs. Because I have learned one thing about law enforcement officers. although they are very, when you see them as a civilian looking at a policeman, they're very stern and serious and all of that. But amongst each other, they are the worst practical jokers on the planet. And they kid each other with no mercy at all. And they're always looking for an opening. It only takes one little thing. These are people that are trained to investigate. So they will investigate each other just as readily as they will anybody else. But eventually I got comfortable with myself as a policeman. After 3 or 4 years, you start to get your confidence level up. And sometimes things are pretty slow. And we used to run a 2-officer car downtown Aberdeen. We'd have 2 cops in 1 car. And some of those nights get to be long, and you talk about a lot of stuff with another cop in the car while you're looking at see which windows are broken or who's walking down the alley or, whatever. And eventually I let people know that I was interested in UFOs. Well, there was an awful lot of kidding over that. I mean, every kind of joke you could imagine, cartoons, things put in my locker. I mean, you name it, they did it. But eventually what happened was I started hearing people who kept saying, well, something crashed down there outside of Westport. And pretty soon I heard more and more of that because I started focusing my questions on that. And I ended up contacting people in the sheriff's office. And next thing I knew, I was down at the library pulling out their old newspaper articles, and it turned out they had 5 newspaper stories that were all related to the Westport crash. So that turned out to be a major, big deal. Then I decided after I joined MUFON, well, I need to make sure that if there are any more UFOs reported around here, I want them to come to me. So this was about the time that they were making the big conversion. It used to be that every police department had its own dispatchers. And maybe some of the major towns, like little towns that were clustered together like Aberdeen, Hoquiam, and Cosmopolis, they would share one radio frequency. Then the sheriff's office had one, and the state patrol and all of that. But each agency had dispatchers. And so each agency was keeping records. Well, eventually they went over to 911 where they have central dispatch. So once they put 911 in, I wrote an official letter to the 911 board saying, you know me, I'm 2SAM2, Aberdeen Police. I'm also State Section Director for the Mutual UFO Network. I would like to ask that if you get any UFO reports, that you refer them to me. And I said, that way, if you have that inconvenient moment as a police dispatcher, when someone is reporting a flying saucer or aliens in their backyard, maybe you can't send policemen to that call, but you can say, we have someone who will look into it for you. And I think that's probably how the UFO cop was born.
Joanne, what is it like being married to the UFO cop?
There are positives and negatives. The negatives is that strange people call in the middle of the night to tell you about aliens that they are seeing, have seen 20 years ago, or hope to see. And they want to talk for a long time. And then people sometimes show up that have seen aliens, and some of them have seen aliens and some of them obviously have not. But that gets a little intrusive at times.
So you get people knocking on your door randomly?
Actually, we haven't had any knockers down here. More like in Aberdeen, we were more visible. But we do get phone calls. Now he always tries to remember to turn off his cell phone at night, and we don't give out our landline. Because, people are, especially that are in the midst of this, sometimes they need help. And, we could go on for a long time talking about abductees or people, whether it's a legitimate sighting or someone who is confused or delusional. We try to believe everyone initially and honor their experience. But sometimes you don't want to do that. Sometimes you don't want to do that right then. So that's the negative.
2 in the morning.
Exactly.
Right. And sometimes I screen the calls. As, no, wrong number. I don't do that, but, And then the positive part, though, is that we've gotten some incredible vacations paid for. We've been to Las Vegas several times. We've been to California and Arkansas, the Oregon coast, around Washington, because people pay Jim to be a speaker and a presenter. And so, you know, they pay for the room, and I get to stay there too. So I get to go and be part of all this excitement. And it's most of the people we meet are fascinating. And, you know, I'm a psychic, and so I've met some very interesting people as well on various levels. And so I'm also a field investigator, because I'm not quite retired yet. I don't do as much investigation as Jim does. I'm a nurse. This is how I make my money, not as a psychic, although more and more we are entering the mediumship realm.
Your psychic life ever get involved in the UFO investigations? Do people come to you for psychic help who have perhaps had an experience with a UFO or an extraterrestrial that you're able to help them with?
I'm getting into that a little bit more. I'm not a hypnotist. A lot of the abductees want to be hypnotized. I've avoided that just because the energy is strange. I probably could do more of that than I do. I've read cards like we went up to Port Townsend this past fall with some people that we knew and trusted, and I did some readings up there for people, and it was very productive and very interesting. So I'm a little careful who I work with.
Right.
And how should I say? It's such a nebulous subject, and people have such intense expectations, and sometimes such profound trauma from the experience that certainly as a registered nurse, I would never get into anything that I thought would be better treated by a healthcare professional in that field too. So it's
that's where you got to be careful. That's why the abduction phenomena is probably the most difficult aspect of ufology, and it's the one that MUFON has the most trouble dealing with. And they've only just now recently, fortunately, they have a branch of specialized assistance that they can give to people who claim that they've been abducted. This is headed up by Kathleen Marden, who is the niece of Betty Hill. This is probably the most famous alien abduction case, the Betty and Barney Hill story from New Hampshire. I believe it was 1961. 1961.
I've read these lectures so many times I can.
That's true. You probably have the facts down better than I on occasion. But she is the niece of Betty Hill, and she is a very dedicated, highly educated woman who really tries to assist people. And they have an examination, basically just a questionnaire, a screening questionnaire for people who believe that they may have been abducted. And then depending on what the results are, she may say, okay, we have some people that we might be able to refer you to talk to. Now the problem is, if they're going to, in other words, where do you draw the line between investigating someone's alien abduction experience and psychological therapy? And if you get into one of those functions that requires a professional license, you've got to have a licensed professional. And if you don't, and someone comes back and says, I mean, let's face it, this is a litigious age we live in. The worry is that someone's going to say, well, I'm going to sue you because you made my trauma worse. You hypnotized me, and now I'm even more messed up than I was before. And
yes, there's another problem too, is that a lot of these people that have had experiences that they're kind of vague about, they want you to elicit more. They want you to do it free, and this takes hours and hours and hours. So that's difficult too. And if someone doesn't remember something, there's usually a reason why they don't remember. Maybe they shouldn't remember. So it's kind of a slippery slope. So as a psychic, anyway, I tend to focus on people's talents and tendencies and finding a positive path with their life. So if people have been traumatized by an experience and kind of find a way to channel it or work with it to a more positive end, I'm glad to work with them for those sort of objectives.
Okay, so tell me a bit about some notable UFO cases in the Pacific Northwest, and maybe some ones that you personally investigated that you care to mention.
Well, that's a really nice, wide-ranging topic. We have I guess a embarrassment of riches in terms of what's available. We start off with June 24th, 1947. We have probably the most famous UFO sighting case right here in Washington State. Kenneth Arnold flying a small plane, broad daylight, across the Mount Rainier, headed for Yakima, sees a formation of crescent-shaped UFOs in formation. He uses a stopwatch. He watches them for quite a while and times how long it takes them to go between two mountain peaks, does a speed estimate, and determines, I believe they're up around 1,200 miles an hour, which nobody was flying any aircraft that looked like that then, let alone that fast. A newspaper reporter interviewing him later said, "How did they fly, Mr. Arnold?" And he was trying to describe the fluttering motion that many people describe about the way UFOs move or float in the air. And he said, well, you know, like if you fly a disc across the water. And the newspaper reporter was trying to shorten his notes, and little did he know that he was changing the English language. And he wrote down flying saucer, and we were forever stuck with that. For all the good and the bad that comes out of that is because of a newspaper reporter interviewing Kenneth Arnold. So that's why I always tell people when I go to other states, I proudly proclaim as a Washingtonian, they came here first. Then, of course, we have the Maury Island incident, which I admit I am not an expert on, but I believe it's contemporary to the Kenneth Arnold sighting. It also involves UFOs over part of Puget Sound, one UFO that supposedly shed metal fragments. That also has been reported in other places, by the way, down in South America in particular, on numerous events. There was an allegation that part of a flying saucer that fell killed a fisherman's dog, as I recall. There was a lot of intrigue, and evidently the Air Force sent 2 officers to interview the people from Maury Island. They recovered a sample of this slag-like material. However, the airplane crashed on the way back. So I don't know if anybody has any of this sample ever. And there's a lot of controversy about that case. Those are probably the 2 most famous UFO cases. In terms of ongoing cases, it turns out that about the same time, bear in mind we have Kenneth Arnold in Washington, June 24th, 1947, which goes slightly forward on your calendar. July 4th, 1947, the July 4th weekend in Roswell, New Mexico. We have the Motherlode UFO event. This is all about the same time. There's a wave of UFO sightings across the United States. In particular, you can get the newspaper articles where police officers on duty in Portland, Oregon, in daylight hours, sighted metallic disc-shaped aircraft. Now, so okay, that's 1947. What does that mean to me? Well, there are a lot of other sightings in between, but I will tell you that this last year, this is another good side about being the UFO cop. This all fits together. We're out doing shopping, my cell phone rings, and there's this very mature sounding man on there, and he says, I need to talk to somebody. One thing leads to another. We have a long interview, and he says, I saw something the other day while I was on duty that changed the way I look at reality. And it turns out that this man works for a law enforcement agency, and I swore to him that I would not reveal where he works. So I won't. I will just tell you that he's not a regular street cop. And on or about July 2nd in downtown Vancouver, Washington, in broad daylight, he watched a disc-shaped aircraft fly across the sky in plain view. And as he put it, he said, I was desperately hoping that it would have wings, jet engines, propellers, anything that would make it normal. It didn't. It was about the size of a quarter held at arm's length, which is one of the investigative questions we always ask of all of our witnesses. If you held an object in your hand at arm's length, what is the smallest object that it would take to cover what you saw. This is a good way of getting an assessment of what the person saw. But in any event, he saw it go across the sky silently. And he said, but that isn't the weird part. And I said, well, what's the weird part? He said it looked like somebody had drawn a line in the sky. And as this craft crossed the line, it disappeared. There appeared to be a ripple in the air, and then it was completely gone. And within 60 seconds, an F-15 fighter plane came roaring in, following the same vector. So that was his sighting. Fortunately, I got this within a few days after the event. I contacted Bill Puckett, who runs UFOs Northwest, who is a retired NOAA weatherman, and he put in a Freedom of Information Act request for the radar data. We did not get the military radar data, but we did get the military data out of the Portland International Airport. Here's the beauty of it. We have unidentified returns in the same area that the witness says that he saw the UFO fly and disappear. In other words, radar returns, there were at least 3 returns indicating the presence of a solid object that had no transponder. It was not an identified aircraft. And we also have the track of the jet fighter. So here I have an extremely high credibility witness, a law enforcement officer, who, by the way, is probably risking his career to make this report. And he said, I picked you because I looked you up on the internet and I saw that you kind of had one foot in both worlds. I know that you know law enforcement and I know that you know UFOs. So I'm very proud of that fact. So now there's an example of a current sighting. And I could give you many, many more. The mysterious triangular craft, they crop up periodically. Many different kinds of shapes, but most of the time they're just here and gone. So they're mysterious. I don't know exactly what it all means or where they're coming from, but they are here.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about a MUFON investigation and what, ideally, what would you like people to know before they submit a report to MUFON?
Well, if I was going to describe the process, we're kind of like when you go to the doctor and you have something wrong and nobody knows what it is. So we're doing what you call an exclusionary diagnosis. I can't totally recreate whatever it was that the person saw. We are making an educated conclusion by eliminating all of the natural or man-made explanations. So whatever you have left, you can pretty much say must be an unknown, or you end up saying we don't have sufficient data to draw a conclusion, because sometimes that's all you've got. As far as what I would like people to do, obviously, I would like them to write down as many details as possible right after the event. Before they do one more thing, get a notebook, a piece of paper, and a pen, and start writing down date, time, location, what it was that you observed. What was the location you first saw the phenomena in, and what was the last location you saw the phenomena in. Usually, we're looking for a compass direction. Now, the other thing I would like people to know is, if you say that it's a fixed light source, or you say that it moved in a straight line, how is it that you can say that that is a true UFO as opposed to a satellite, planet, etc. that you are not familiar with? There is a very great variance in how much people know about what normally should be in the night sky. I run into people, for instance, who do not know that with the exception of the North Star, all stars will move about 15 degrees every hour. Because actually, of course, the stars are not moving, we are. Because you take 24 times 15 degrees, you get 360. And obviously we rotate once every 24 hours. There are a lot of people who don't know that. They don't know, for instance, that the planets move in different orbits. And so a planet may rise into view and go out of view within 2 to 3 hours. They don't know, for instance, that Sirius, I've had 2 Sirius reports this year because of the unusually clear night skies. Yes, in 1 week.
Yes.
Sirius is the second brightest thing in the sky. People don't realize that. Or they don't, here's the other one that they're not aware of. And obviously, when in doubt, go ahead and make the report. But I'm just saying, I would like people to know that we're not trying to discourage them, but at the same time, we're trying to be objective. We're trying to separate out the signal from the noise. And one more report of a light in the sky that nobody is really sure about is not going to solve the mystery of UFOs. The number 1 culprit for misidentified objects in the sky, without a doubt, is the International Space Station. I want them to hang a banner on the back that says, "I am not a UFO." Now, if you have not looked at the International Space Station, go to the NASA website, put in your city and your state and all of that, and you can see exactly when the International Space Station will come across your sky. And sometimes when it goes directly overhead, it takes 5 to 6 minutes to make the transit. It's extremely bright. It gets people's attention. It doesn't look normal, but it's just a space station, and you can wave at them when they go overhead. But it is not the commander of the alien armada. I'm sorry, but hate to burst your bubble, but some things are extraordinary that are man-made and natural. The night sky is really beautiful, and you should educate yourself a little bit. If you still want to make a report to MUFON, make a report. Give us as many details as you can, but try to separate out objective from subjective. If you see something that you can't explain, you can talk yourself into being scared. That does not mean that the object was watching you. I mean, we need to be a little bit reasonable here. If you're in a large city with 300,000 or 400,000 people and you see a light in the sky that you can't explain, I don't believe that that light is watching you watch it. I don't know how we're going to sell that to anybody. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there are a lot of tremendous UFO sightings out there. There's one high-quality UFO event somewhere in the world every hour of every single day. That's high strangeness with high witness credibility. And I will just tell you that in following the standard of Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who's one of the founding fathers of ufology, probably the first man to really take a scientific approach to UFO investigation, he basically said if it was further than 500 feet away after dark, he would not study the report. In other words, those are just lights in the sky. What can you really do with it? I mean, obviously, if I see a light in the sky and it makes a right angle turn or does something really weird like that, I can probably say, yeah, that's a UFO, all right. But what have I really got that adds to the body of knowledge? Not much. If I see a structured vehicle that has that's glowing, that is a giant triangle and has very odd lights on it that can hover and then shoot off at an extremely high velocity, now I've got something. That's a trufo. So I guess what I'm saying is just be aware that when you report something to MUFON, we're trying to be reasonable and objective. It's not personal. We're trying to do the best we can with the data that the public gives us. And we are all about public education and outreach too. So I guess with that,
I was going to say that the report that people fill out that's on the Mutual UFO website site that they fill out is really pretty informative. For instance, it asks if you held an object out at arm's length, how big would it be? And it suggests an aspirin or a quarter. So they just check the boxes. The same with the weather and the direction. So if people just conscientiously fill out the form, we collect a lot of data. And of course, it's really great if they have supporting witnesses. My wife was out there too. My father-in-law was with me. My son was there. So you have more than one person looking. And of course, I think the most frustrating ones are people that take photos, look at them a while later and discover that there's this alien in the photo, which if they don't see it at the time, kind of what's the point? And then usually it's a reflection, or it's we almost always can explain those away. And part of the validity is the experience itself and how the person feels at the time, and the multitude of senses. Did you hear anything? Did you smell anything? Did you feel anything? There are a lot of types of information people receive besides just seeing a large white light up there.
So in fact, that kind of a case is really frustrating. The ones where I call them photo artifact cases, where somebody goes home and they look at their digital photos and, oh yeah, there's a UFO there. Well,
it's a bird.
There's a problem there because we really don't have a witness from a legal viewpoint.
True.
We don't have a person who in a court of law, not that we take these to court, but I try to follow a legal investigative standard, which when someone takes a photograph, the photographer has to be able to say in a court of law that at a certain time, date, and location, the photo is a true and accurate representation of what was observed. And obviously, by definition, we don't have that in this situation. The other, I guess while we're talking about photographs of UFOs, everyone now has a cell phone.
Right.
And it's cool that somebody says, I took a photograph of the UFO. However, when I get a black rectangle and it has one orange dot in it, forgive me if I'm not overly excited. Because what am I going to do with that? For one thing, they always say it's a photo of a UFO. I don't even know what compass direction they were facing when they took the photo. I don't know what elevation they were at when they took the photo. How can I assess that? There's nothing I can do with it. I have documented cases, for instance. Oh, the other big frustration we have. Chinese lanterns or sky lanterns. They drive UFO researchers crazy. And they seem to be very prevalent on the holidays. Orange lights that gradually drift across the sky that are following the direction of the prevailing breeze that eventually go out as they float away and upwards. Those are not UFOs. Those are Chinese lanterns. And when you try and photograph them, they will come up as orange dots in the middle of a black background. They don't really prove anything, and they don't really solve the mystery of UFOs. Now, having said that, of course, there are also orange lights that are exceedingly mysterious and are entirely worthy of investigation. But if you really think about it, there is a huge difference.
Good. Yes.
I think we pretty well
And
covered
one
it.
thing we do, we've gotten quite a few reports lately of 3 orange lights that seem to form often an equilateral triangle, or else an isosceles triangle, but they're not the conventional lighting formations you would see on a regular aircraft. And they seem to move in unison enough to assume that they are on an object, not just freestanding lights. And we've gotten a lot of those, and it's kind of cool when they corroborate each other, because, especially if you get them from the same location. And,
Exactly.
And so that's why it's worth reporting, and we don't want people to second guess themselves. Oh, the orange lights must be, Chinese lanterns. If you really think it's extraordinary, go ahead and report it. We'll weed it out. But if we get, 5 of them from up on Kitsap County in one night, that's extraordinary and needs to be investigated further.
Exactly.
She loves aliens.
In terms of the strangest cases, I would have to say there have been several where, after I interviewed the witnesses, I realized that these people apparently witnessed almost like a flaw in reality. In other words, something that was so extraordinary that it would make you question all of your assumptions about how the universe works. I had a millwright who wanted to tell me about he and his friend, who back in the early 80s were taking a walk in eastern Washington. And while they were walking along the road, I guess I have to preface this by saying, I think we've all, you know how whenever you're next to a huge piece of machinery, or like you stand next to a jet airplane, something that's massive, you have this feeling of being next to something very solid and massive. Well, he and his friend are going along the road, walking, and while he was there, he said that some sort of giant craft moved along right above the ground, and when he looked up, he could see a distortion in the air. He said it was like you were standing too close to a giant television screen. So close enough that it sort of pixelated. And this thing moved by them, and he said it was like if you were standing on the runway at SeaTac and a 747 taxied right by you, only it was invisible. So you knew it was there, and you knew that you were running the risk of being run over, but you couldn't actually see the thing. And he also described how right before this arrived, he put it, the air went slack. This turns out to be a commonly reported phenomena. It will be described a number of ways. In this instance, he said all of the normal ambient sounds just dropped away. No insects, no birds, you can't hear the breeze, nothing. As he put it, the air went slack. Other people have described that right before they get into one of these extraordinary events, including abduction events, there's like a local transformation of reality. They will describe how the air becomes thick, or how everything just becomes tense, like it's charged, right before the event and right after it. So it's almost like there's a field around it. That always gets my attention because it's so eerie, and somehow to me it really makes sense. I've had instances of people who reported reptilian beings, which on the face of it seems impossible, like there must be something wrong with this person. But then after I've spent time with them and really talked to them about their experience, I've walked away thinking they really saw what they're reporting. And it's almost like reality, well, there was like a flaw in it, or a tear, or an opening, or something different. Those kind of cases really get my attention. Again, where you have the extreme high strangeness with what turns out to be a credible witness. That's kind of what you sort of live for when you're investigating these things. You want one that's, really credible and really far out at the same time. Because it's only at the edges of reality that we're likely to make a breakthrough in our understanding of what this is, or how it works, or what it means. We're going to have to be operating right on the edge of what we assume to be true about reality, because it's not going to conform to our notions of reality. We're going to have to learn how to get to the level that these things operate on. And so our minds have to expand. They're not going to come down to our level. We're going to have to go up to theirs. That's what I'm really looking for. And a good cat.
She's Jim's cat. That's lucky.
Yes.
Anything, final words you'd like to say to the internet?
A number of people that are very credible, including Peter Davenport, who receives dozens of reports a day at the UFO Reporting Center from people that he logs in. you feel that it's not going to be long before there is a real big shift. And a huge part, the tipping point deal. A few people now can see it. You get enough people that are genuine experiencers, and pretty soon the whole reality shifts. And a lot of people feel that we are at that.
We're close.
Point. Very, very cool. People have said the number 2015. So
it's possible. I think we were close in 1997, March 13th, 1997, when they had the UFOs, the Phoenix Lights. Was an extremely large-scale event with hundreds, if not thousands, of witnesses. Now, the media was able to shut that down. But that one it probably was a tipping point for many people who lived down there. Whereas day by day, more and more people have come to the conclusion that we are being contacted by aliens. And this has been going on. They don't appear to be hostile. If they were, we would be not having this conversation. And
you'll notice the media has picked up on this. There's a lot more informational shows, even tongue-in-cheek shows, that Alien on that cartoon thing that I watch. And that, and just in general, more figures. Our granddaughter has a lot of toys that look like alien figures, classic alien figures. She's 2 years old and she can identify aliens.
So it's interesting. We are winning the battle because, in fact, I think if you were to do any kind of survey of, people younger than me, and you said, are UFOs real? Is the government withholding information about the reality of UFOs and contact with extraterrestrials? Most people are going to go, duh. Yeah. They're going to, we know that. We've known it for a long time. And that's kind of sad in a way. And what's even sadder to me, I guess, if I was going to say one thing, is that other countries are way more progressive than we are. The South American countries have openly said UFOs are real. We don't know what they are. And we're inviting the public to participate with the government to explore this phenomena. France has been very progressive. Their space agency would be the equivalent of NASA. They actually have a UFO investigative branch called JPAN, which is part of their organization. So other countries have a totally different approach to this. It's not just the way they do it here is not the right way. We have an adversarial relationship because it's all locked down by the military, and there's all this secrecy in it. Goes back to Roswell and all that history that happened thereafter. Even if you don't, that's the other thing I love about UFOs. Just studying the history is amazing. You're dealing with the history of the military, the history of secrecy. We start talking about, when the NSA made the news and they were talking about, is the government spying on people? Is there like another government within a government that operates autonomously from Congress and the president? Well, I hate to say this, but UFO researchers were talking about this 20 or 30 years ago. We all knew that was true because of how the UFO researchers have been treated by our own government. We saw this happening a long time ago. So studying UFOs is actually very frontline, right at the center of what's going on. Not to mention the fact, back to where we started, coming full circle, proving that this is real is a game changer. It would force mankind to completely shift how we view the universe. And I think that's one of the things that they're afraid of. They're afraid that when this becomes a reality, human beings are going to start looking at each other as Terrans, people of the planet Earth, and they will no longer care about being divided up according to race, nationality, political party, religion, etc. They're going to start saying, everybody is an Earth person, and we need to meet our brethren out there that way. So I don't know what happens, whether they will come out in the open and we will be forced to change the way we think, or maybe we will grow up, change the way they think, that we think, and then they will appear. In other words, that's what Arthur C. Clarke called childhood's end. And I sort of hope that we're close. That's my hope.